What's some of the best advice that you could give some young bands, some young kids that are just starting out, that are having fun at it, that are in high school, that want to make a name for themselves, that are looking to go places, and there is some real talent out there, but it's a very difficult market. Do you have any advice for that type of person?
Since I'm 16 years old, and full-time, as a 16-year-old full-time, I taught guitar, I managed bands, I played in bands, produced, shopped bands, shopped record deals. Bill Bogart and I owned 3 nightclubs. We owned a newspaper that we took nationwide, magazine. I mean, everything you could imagine, independent record labels, everything you could imagine in the music business. And looking back on it, if I could turn back time, or actually, I mean, you're talking about now, kids now. What if you just decide to do an album a year, every year of your life, whether you're 16 years old, 17 years old, say we're going to do an album a year, no matter what. We don't care if a single person buys the record. We don't care if everyone hates the record, but we're going to write, rehearse, arrange, produce, and ultimately record this record. Somehow or another, exploit it afterwards. But going in with the attitude of, look, we don't care, we could care less if one person buys this record. We're just going to do it, just for the hell of it, we're going to do it. And you do that every year of your life. And if you could possibly do it under the same name, you'd be really breaking some ground compared to what's going on now. I mean, back in the 60s and the 70s, and in the 80s it really stopped, but there were 10 album bands that were together for 10 albums. You don't see that anymore. I mean, in the 80s, Def Leppard, we were doing an album every 3 years, every 4 years. Time in between, people were promoting their albums longer, MTV and the videos. People really milked albums much longer. And what happened is bands would break up before they'd get to 6 albums, 7 albums. There are very few 10-album bands out there. So what if instead of putting all this pressure on yourselves, a band would actually say, look, we're going to become a 10-album band. We don't care if a single person buys these records. Because you know what's going to happen is you're going to write, rehearse, arrange, produce, record, and somehow try to exploit, in a positive sense, exploit this material to get it out there, whether it's through MySpace or the internet of some kind, iTunes, records, maybe you get an independent record label, major record label if you're fortunate, some kind of soundtrack outlet. But after a couple of albums of doing this, really the bands that decide to put out full albums are going to really put a big distance between themselves and the bands that aren't. Sooner or later, something's going to happen, right? I don't know many 10-album bands that have no market, that have no following. And I guess a cynic would say, well, you haven't heard of them. If they put out 10 albums, you haven't heard of them. There's very few that are out there that have no market whatsoever. And, certainly at some point you're going to get some kind of exposure. You have 5 or 6 albums now. I mean, you have to have something going on there. You're going to be much better than bands who just haven't done it. And especially bands back when I was talking about that in the 80s, 90s, bands were doing demos. They would do demos and they'd say, okay, we're going to go in and we're going to record. Nowadays there's Pro Tools. I mean, it's nothing to record an album. Back then, back when I was 16 years old at 1983, you needed $40 an hour easily. I mean, easily needed $40 an hour to do a 24-track recording studio. You're not going to record an album in something less, or if you're a hardcore band or a thrash band, maybe you would, but $40 an hour is the cheapest. I mean, nowadays, 15-year-old kids have Pro Tools and could use it like masters. I mean, there's really no excuse for not doing albums, for bands not doing albums. And once you get to a certain point, something should start happening. you start recording, rehearsing. I always thought it was, you know, there's a line between the concept of quantity has a quality all itself, and then just pumping out bad material for the sake of putting out bad material. I used to say to bands, look, you have very little material. Why don't you write 100 songs? All right, just start now. Just write 100 songs, good, bad, ugly. Just put out 100 songs, and just force them to do it, challenge them to do it. And maybe they'll say, all right, just to get through this, we'll just bang out a bunch of cheesy songs. And sooner or later, their pride takes over, and they just can't do it. Or maybe what starts happening is midway through the 20-song portion or the 30-song portion, they realize that parts of these songs are good, and they can start putting some things together. But it's the idea of quantity has a quality all its own that I think that should be, at least you shouldn't ignore that as a possibility. But here's a quick point. We had a band, and they had some interest from MCA years ago, and the head of MCA's A&R department really liked his band, and they, you know, kind of impressed him at the first showcase, and then he quickly came down to a next showcase, and it was all the same material, and he was real concerned about how seriously they were taking this. Like, he was under the impression that they should have been writing a lot more, and we were pushing them. As it turns out, one of the guys they just kicked out of the band, right as we got involved, was probably the main writer, and we didn't realize that until afterwards. So we kicked out what was in essence the main writer of the band, and it certainly hampered them. The A&R man said, look, I don't know what these guys are doing. You know, they played the same 6 songs they played for me in the last showcase. We usually try to keep a showcase, especially when we try to showcase about 6 songs. And even though there was some changes in there, he saw it as that they're really not writing quick enough. Like, he thought they'd be pumping out demo after demo, even if it was 4-track, box type material, that they'd be banging out material. They'd really take this seriously. And at the same time, and I don't know what year it was, but I remember Tom Petty was on MCA, and he had just presented a double album to the label, and his A&R guy said, you know, he said, look, we're only going to do a single album, and he was pushing and pushing and pushing from what we heard to do this double album, and they said, no, we're just putting out a single album, and MCA won out, and they put out the single album. At the same time, we're talking with this band, and we're saying, look, you got to write more material. You know, you really have to write more material. And the A&R man, I won't say his name, he was very, very adamant about them writing more. So we said, look, you got to write some more. Really, you're taking a very lax attitude, and this is a real opportunity here. You guys can, you know, really do something here. They like you. They don't have an act like you, and they're looking right now. And the singer said to my brother and I, who was my partner in managing the band, he said, look, man, this is odd. This is odd. You got to tell him that you can't force odd. I can't force odd. You guys can't force odd. You can't force odd. When it comes out, it comes out. Man, no way can you force odd. So I said, listen, Picasso, write some fucking songs. Not rock operas, not symphonies. Write some fucking songs. Write some 3-chord songs that you're always writing. What are you talking about? Write some songs. This guy's gonna throw you on his head, on your head. He doesn't care about you, your art or whatever. Get some damn songs out. And he says, well, we got an album's worth of material. I said, who said you have an album's worth of material? Tom Petty just came to these guys and said, I have 2 albums worth of material. And they said, no, you don't, Tom. You have 1.